Greetings, friends of liberty. One story of my life, as yet untold, was my meeting professional revolutionary and all-around Enlightenment prodigy, Thomas Paine, in the summer of 1791. As it transpired, Paine was in the midst of composing his Revolutionary Rights of Man Part 2, published next year. I, walking through London and feeling the need for the refreshment of the coffee bean, stopped at the nearest penny house, the Gelded Hamster, and after ordering a coffee with double portions of milk and sugar, was astonished to see Mr. Paine himself unattended, seated directly ahead. Asking his leave, I soon joined him and, given our mutual love of politics, before long returned to the subject of his work in progress, his book, The Rights of Man, Part 2. Now, although in Part 1, Thomas had primarily responded to the arguments of conservative Edmund Burke by arguing against hereditary monarchy, but for the natural rights of all human beings and for the social contract, for the establishment of government in Part 2, our revolutionary told me intended to go in different, and to my mind, an unwelcome direction. Here he wanted to argue, A, that all citizens of a country, notably the elderly and the poor, have the right to receive welfare payments from the government, which means, of course, from their fellow citizens. Secondly, he wanted to argue that all children have the right to be educated, not by the parents, but at public expense. How did he ever propose to pay for all this welfare? By vastly reducing the size of the army. Truly, I've never heard anything quite so fantastic. I pointed out to Thomas that previously he had argued that human beings have the right to be left alone by their fellow man, that their property rights not be violated. But in this Part 2, he was arguing for the opposite. In other words, not that the government exists to protect rights and property, but instead to take it from Paul and give it to Peter. Utterly contradictory. Paine replied by giving me an extended dialogue about how the needs of the poor, the uneducated, and the children surpassed the necessity for protecting property. But I replied that this is what every thief says. He wants and says he needs what you have. And Paine, contradicting his previous affirmation of the obligation of the government to protect property rights, has now turned it into the destroyer of property rights. To this, Mr. Paine uncharacteristically had no response. Now, if we turn to the issue of just what it is that Enlightenment political philosophers should advocate and what they shouldn't, in your own 21st century throughout the West, we find today the book of Swedish classical liberal philosopher Nils Karlson and his reviving classical liberalism against populism. Here, Karlson means by populism the relatively recent rise of various so-called populist movements and leaders, which he identifies as Donald Trump, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Viktor Orban in Hungary, Erdogan in Turkey, and Bolsonaro in Brazil, all of whose rise he regards as an unwelcome trend. Karlson begins by trying to define populism, saying that while it is hard to define, it comes in many shades, some to the left and some to the right, but also in the center. This is often the case in the book. He uses the definitions of another thinker, here saying that South American populism is characterized by A, the election or rise of a charismatic leader who advocates policies to redistribute income, and who sometimes exhibits bad boy manners. B, the fact that the economy develops various problems such as inflation, flight of capital, no foreign currency, and budget deficits. like Donald Trump, hugely increasing budget deficits in the US, and that these problems start intensifying. And C, that in South American countries, the economic system then often collapses with currency devaluation and with a new government starting over again. In summary, in all cases, South American or otherwise, as a result of the populist policies, the real incomes, and particularly the incomes of the poor, declined to levels significantly lower than when the populist episode started. Moreover, the institutions of democracy in the open society were undermined. So this presents its basic definitional example of populism. Always negative, always destructive of democracy, and to some degree of the economy of the country afflicted. He also, in addition, mentions that populism often allows democratic majorities to violate the rights of individuals, disregarding or ignoring constitutional protections. Finally, he believes that these ideas originated from the philosophers from Friedrich Nietzsche, Martin Heidegger, and Carl Schmitt, later developed by thinkers within postmodernism and critical theory to form the basis for both left and right-wing populism. Having seen his basic definition, let's now examine a few additional refinements and qualifications that he makes. Number one, first refinement. He says that populists use an us versus them logic, playing off one group against others, examples being AOC's Greens against those who don't care about climate change, the workers against the elites, the far left versus the alt-right, natives versus foreigners, experts versus lay people, the globalists versus anti-immigrants, and the protectionists believing in made in America versus free traders. Populists, in other words, he says, like to pit one group against another. Number two, secondly, he argues that populist leaders tend to go after members of the opposition by manipulating elections, thwarting the free press, changing the Constitution in their own favor, and circumscribing minority civil, political, and economic rights. Thirdly, he says that the most popular explanation for the rise of populism is that policy failures have caused a deterioration of the economic and social conditions for important groups in our societies. So the populists are responding to these failures. I agree completely. But in the end, he largely dismisses these arguments, saying, while failing policies may indeed have contributed to different social and economic problems, especially for some groups, it is hard to see that this is the major explanation. Similarly, he dismisses cultural changes, such as the increasing isolation exemplified in Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, as a major reason. Number four, he argues that human beings have a mind in which intuitive decisions are fast, automatic, and effortless, while rational decisions are slower and taken into a more controlled fashion. Often, the former, more intuitive systems take over. Hence, we are intrinsically moralistic, critical, and judgmental, fostering polarization between groups and society at large. In other words, humans have a tribal mind that can be activated by populist rhetoric and leaders. Here he tries to support this argument with references to a recent book by historian Anne Applebaum and another by social psychologist Jonathan Haidt, whose book, The Righteous Mind, famously made this argument. Number five, he also argues, along with Jonathan Haidt, that another trait of modern society that exacerbates the tribal mind is that digitalization and social media seem to have led to polarization and the denigration of independent journalists to the expense of open, evidence-based public debate. He arguing that Donald Trump's use of Twitter was, and Truth Social now is, a prime example. Number six, he argues that populists exploit the human need for meaning and a sense of personal and social identity, saying, without identity, humans are deprived of a sense of belonging, and they also lack a purpose in life, character, pride, and self-esteem, all with negative consequences. Populist collective identity dominates and undermines individual character and long-term relationships in communities. It uses identity as a means to get into power. Now, having seen his basic theory and the additional refinements he makes to it, let's turn to the final part of the book, his solutions for how to revive a classically liberal society. Number 1, he says, the world will not change for the better unless classical liberals start fighting back and expose the populist strategies and their consequences. Number 2, how should they do this? He says, classical liberals should explain to policymakers and the public how liberal institutions contribute to prosperity and welfare, as well as to meaning, community, and virtue. Number 3, he says, in addition, that modern classical liberals have largely neglected that humans have a quest for meaning, community, belonging, identity. And liberal institutions, just as importantly, provide the foundations for a civil society with clubs, voluntary organizations, families, and other forms of associations. This is a tradition that also goes back to the Scottish Enlightenment. Number 4, more broadly, he believes a revival of the liberal spirit, as exemplified by what Deirdre McCloskey has called the bourgeoisie virtues, which go beyond mere financial and personal prudence. Finally, number 5, he argues, contrary to some classical liberals, however, that to make an open liberal society inclusive and gain broad support, we need to promote basic social protection, education, and decency. Some redistribution and political interference are undeniably required. So having now seen both his description of populism and his proposed solutions to it, let me diagram what I regard as the many weaknesses of his approach. Number 1, his definition of populism is faulty. There is nothing per se in populism which is bad or politically coercive. Populism is just what's popular, and that means it depends completely on historical circumstances. Proof that his definition fails would be A, the American Revolution, which was exceedingly popular and yet one of the greatest events in human political and civilizational history, and B, more recently, the Tea Party movement, which fought against the manipulation of the economy exhibited by the Great Recession, and also against Obama's identity politics and Obamacare disaster. Number 2, not only is his definition of populism faulty, but also his definition of what classical liberalism should be. The purpose of the government is just to protect property rights and nothing else. That's the most successful recipe for civilizational success mankind has ever discovered. So when he says that almost all classical liberals would agree that education for all children, basic scientific research, a well-functioning infrastructure, support for the vulnerable, weak, and unfortunate, various kinds of environmental protection, and perhaps other so-called essential services should be included, this is utterly false. These all damage and compromise the very principle I just outlined and make society overall worse, because the private sector can do all these things immeasurably better. The only purpose of government is protecting rights, on the other hand. That maximizes the discovery and use of knowledge in society. Typical proof of what I just said is the disaster of modern American public education, both K-12 and higher, which has resulted in twice the costs per pupil on average that private K-12 schools would cost for the same quality education. And in higher education, the public funding and regulations incubating and nurturing highly destructive ideologies such as wokeism, transgender ideology, racism against whites, hardcore and man-hating feminism, extreme net zero environmentalism, and others. These enormous harms to our society resulting again from the public funding and control of higher education since the 60s, he's completely oblivious to. And right on down the line for all the other so-called essential services allegedly needing to be supplied by government, such as medical care, which also, like education, has been severely damaged by its public nature and funding. His complete cluelessness on what classical liberalism should be, just the protection of property rights by government and no more, invalidates much of his whole argument. Number 3, he says a third kind of argument, developed already by Mill, is that liberalism may need a new kind of liberal religion, which he calls the religion of humanity, to sustain the virtues, values, and beliefs that a liberal society needs to be sustained. Has he never heard of philosophy? One of the greatest champions and defenders of classical liberalism, as inspiring and as powerful as any single thinker over the last century, wasn't Ayn Rand and her objectivism. Does he grasp this? Not really. He says, while doing a good job at exposing the negative effects of collectivist ideas, her conception of human motivation and development is, in my view, way too narrow and self-oriented. Failure number 3, son of Karl. Number 4, he doesn't make clear enough from the beginning that there is a difference between classical liberalism and modern liberalism. They're two completely different things, as Ayn Rand and many others have pointed out. Number 5, as we've seen, he argues for a tribal human nature, saying again, humans seem to have a latent authoritarian predisposition. Our minds are psychologically designed for populist tribalism and righteousness, fostering polarization between groups and in society at large. This is false. Human beings are tribal when it makes sense to be tribal, like in the Stone Age, or nowadays among the Hottentots, and are not when it doesn't. Human beings respond to their social environments and civilizational context. And thus, when all you've got is a tribe, you become tribal. But when you've got the tremendous richness of modern society, in whose cities you can meet great people from 10 other countries in 20 minutes who love freedom and understand that protecting property rights is the linchpin of all successful civilizations, then this kind of group attachment to people who love freedom is what's practical. Jonathan Haidt's theories about political instincts notwithstanding. Finally, number 6, when he says that while failing policies may indeed have contributed to different social and economic problems, it is hard to see that this is the major explanation of populism. This too fails. The American Revolution was directly caused by the failures of British tax policy. The Tea Party revolution from 2009 on was caused by the governmental failures that caused the Great Recession and Obama's failures. Donald Trump's rise has been caused partly by the rise of woke ideology in the universities and beyond, as well as by the climate baloney of AOC's attempted New Green Deal and many other ideological idiocies, such as trans ideology. And finally, the rise of populist parties on the right in Europe and Britain has been caused by the very definite failures of trying to combine an extensive and highly developed liberal welfare state with an open borders immigration policy, resulting in the importation in huge amounts of welfare, for example, to Muslims bent on destroying or severely changing their adopted countries. Given these 6 serious errors, I would give it a C-D+, although it will have some value to someone who's never been exposed to the ideas he talks about here. Happy for my part that we late 18th century Englishmen understand and love the true liberal idea of freedom and the reverse of the coin, the protection of property rights, as well as any civilization that's ever existed. I bid you well and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.